I invite the Bishop of Edmondsbury and Ipswich to introduce and begin the presentation. You have up to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin Seeley, 35, St Edmondsbury and Ipswich. This presentation originally was going to be a presentation with Professor David Ford, whom a number of you will know, Regis Emeritus Professor from Cambridge, recently written a commentary on John's Gospel. David, I think some of you will know, has been quite seriously ill, has been in hospital and is recovering at home and needs to rest. So it is, very sadly, not with David, but we continue with Veronica Hailey, who is the other person, so a pair of people who've been working very closely with me on this work. And Veronica is the Dean of the Business School of the University of Bristol, and she is the one who's been engaged with the research on this question of trust. So I'm going to hand over to Veronica for her presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Professor Veronica Hailey from the University of Bristol, as Bishop Martin has introduced me. I was approached by Bishop Martin to join this project because I'd previously conducted research on trust and trustworthiness within a Church of England diocese over an 18-month period pre-COVID, which resulted in a confidential report to the bishop's team. At that time, I worked with about 130 clergy in the diocese at various levels, and they conducted their own research into the problems of trust within their parishes, the data from which was presented to the bishop's team in the report. In addition, and since the financial crisis and beyond, I've worked with a large number of major private corporations and public institutions on all different types of trust dynamics: blind trust, trust repair, building trust, preserving trust. There are many, many dimensions to trust. My main roles in this project were to bring knowledge of the current trust research to bear, to build on the work that I'd conducted within the diocese, but most importantly, to interview on a confidential basis a broad range of clergy and lay people from a position of someone not within the church itself, and to analyse that data using coding and present that analysis in the form of themes to the rest of the team and the steering group. I am a regular worshipper within the Church of England and have been since I was born. I hold no office whatsoever in the institution and never have done, and Professor David Ford and I have worked on a pro bono basis on this project. Now, 4 frequently asked questions about trust. Why does trust matter? Well, research shows that organisations that enjoy higher levels of trust also enjoy higher levels of problem solving, innovation, engagement, knowledge sharing, and commitment to change. It's a jolly good thing to have. And what is trust? Well, it's a relationship between a trustor and a trustee. And as such, it is a gift that somebody bestows upon another person. And they bestow that gift in the knowledge that they are making themselves vulnerable in the face of uncertainty. That is what trust is. It is about not knowing, it is about being uncertain, but to still go forward on the basis that the individual or the organisation you believe has your best intentions at its heart. So what builds high trust? Well, what my research has shown is that if you want a high trust organisation, then you need really trustworthy behaviours at every level of that organisation, and in its systems and in its decision-making processes. And how does someone judge whether a person or an organisation is trustworthy? Well, they've pulled down 4 criteria. Firstly, It's not a soft criteria, it's a hard criteria. They ask, is this person able and competent to do their role, to fulfill their job, to fulfill their purpose? Is there a competence there? We don't go to 38,000 feet with a pilot without knowing that that person can fly the plane. The second one is benevolence. Can I see that these people are bothered about others, or are they entirely self-serving? Thirdly, is there integrity? Is there a moral code actually guiding their decision-making and their behaviors? And then the fourth criteria is predictability. Can I see those other three, ability, benevolence, and integrity, on a regular and consistent basis? And that is how people judge whether to trust each one of us in this room. So the question we were asked to explore was where we could find evidence of how clergy or laity in the church created high-trust work environments where doing so necessitated overcoming differences in opinion over doctrine or the practice of faith. So what were the barriers that we found to creating trust in this context? Barrier number one are the major breaches of integrity and morality around racism and abuse, which will take years to repair. It became obvious in the interviews that for some, not all, but for some, the shadow of the major breaches of trust around racism and abuse permeated external perceptions of the institution and made people despondent. An archdeacon said to me, the world outside looks at the church and sees what it has failed to do. It does not love and it does not protect. In addition, complaints were made by some interviewees about the way issues of racism and safeguarding had been managed by the institution. As one interviewee put it, the cover-up of the cover-up. I note that these major breaches have been and continue to be the subject of other investigations and change programs within the church. Barrier number two, the surfacing of debate along tribal lines. Loyalty to a church tradition grouping, referred to by some interviewees as tribes, and the declaration and upholding of the rights of that tribe or grouping were reported by some interviewees as seemingly more important to a few clerics than loyalty or felt obligation to the main institution of the church. Interviewees, particularly some archdeacons, reported having observed anxiety felt by some younger clergy public. Barrier number four, many saw the decline in trust in the church as symptomatic of increasing distrust within UK society more generally. As one archdeacon said, the external culture of fragmentation, suspicion, animosity, us and them, has infiltrated the church to an extent, and I cannot think of a period in history where suspicion has been so high. Barrier number five, senior leaders are the focus of criticism. There were criticisms of bishops being somewhat remote, perhaps in both their practice and demeanour. A member of the clergy said, I think if I'm honest, I don't trust the House of Bishops. The process, it's lacked transparency, and they're representative of a process that has twisted and turned and just hasn't seemed to be led with any great clarity or authority, or yes, trustworthiness, to be honest. At the same time, some other interviewees remarked that by elevating bishops in an almost messianic manner, only served to heighten expectations of these individuals who perhaps disappointingly have been revealed as only human, not divine, and therefore likely to be as flawed as you and I are in this hall. As one person said to me in the interviews, followership is about looking for the best in your leaders. They're not perfect, people might make mistakes, And it's not about shooting them down because every time they make an error or get something wrong. I mean, there's no compassion in that, is there? That's just lock, load, and shoot. Barrier number 6, the structures, systems, and decision-making processes of the organization itself also appeared to disable trust repair and trust building in the way they obscured transparency and tried to manage debate. Another archdeacon said, we do end up with a lot of managed spaces with unreal consultation, which just increases the trust deficit. And another, I've been on a number of church bodies at different levels where I've had the impression that decisions have been made somewhere else and that this agenda is being carefully managed, so there's no possibility that this particular body would do something unexpected that would interfere with the master plan. And the last barrier, barrier number 7, quo vadis. The more obvious issues of diminishing status within a secularized society, constrained and unequally distributed resources resulting in overstretched clergy in some parishes, all these were identified by the clergy themselves in the research conducted during 2018 and 2019 by myself in the diocese, but they were echoed again in these more recent interviews. Some interviewees spoke about the crisis of trust also being about the failure of the Church of England to carve out a distinctive new role in 21st century UK society. Some thought a clearer and inspiring articulation of the Church about its role in UK society was needed to give hope, to counteract the narrative around decline, and to provide an alternative, inspiring narrative for the outside world, rather than just the airing of the internal debates about sexuality dominating the press and media. As one interviewee said, what it means is that there is a climate in which the Church can't take anything for granted. We deserve the criticism, but we are now establishing something that is much more authentic. It's really painful, but it's the birth pangs of something new. So, to end on a high. And I am ending on a high because I found these interviews truly inspiring. I was lucky to talk to the people I did and to work with the people I did. So, what were the positive forces for creating high trust in the Church? I think it's worth noting these solutions that the interviewees told me about were happening at the level of everyday practice. They're not ideas, they're not theories, they're happening. There are green shoots here, and I've personally felt inspired. Everyday solution number 1, making time for reflection and prayer together, individually and institutionally. Interviewees pointed to the length of time it had taken the Church of England to work through the issue of the ordination of women, and they felt that the LLF issue would take the same amount of time. This is not an intellectual question. It is for many on both sides of the debate an emotional question about their faith, identity, their hearts, and their conscience. And you don't change deep-seated attitudes and behaviors without recognizing the length it will take to make personal transition on issues such as this. Everyday solution number 2, as well as making time, people emphasized the need to create safe spaces for discussion. A number of interviewees spoke about the historical examples of where the Church had created safe spaces for debate. Again, the ordination of women was brought up, where retreats were held, where people from both sides of the debate around women's ordination could meet and speak openly and hear from others without judgment or chastisement. And yes, people brought up suspending judgment on social media. I mean, could you have mutually negotiated keyboard warrior vacations, maybe? Everyday solution number 3, making this real and making this personal. people told me that differences in opinion could be overcome by getting to know individuals so that they became a person to relate to, not a cause to fight. It becomes incumbent on those individuals to be the most able, the most benevolent, the ones with the biggest integrity, in short, the most trustworthy that they can be. And examples were again drawn from the debates around the ordination of women. One woman priest described the difficulty of becoming ordained and working alongside men who were against the ordination of women, but she talked about inhabiting her role humbly and making sure that she was a gentle and compassionate priest in her dealings with the colleagues who opposed her. Another person described a male cleric who came out, but she respected very, very deeply, and she consciously and slowly moved her opinion against LLF based on her personal trust and respect for that one person. Everyday solution number 4. What became apparent was when the church focuses on people in real need in the community, then those who are in desperate need of the church's love, that focus allows people to overcome difference. It's what one military chaplain calls the gritty, sweaty, salty stuff of life, that when you face into that, you are able to overcome your differences. Multiple examples were given of this, where the imperative to minister to people in dangerous, precarious situations allowed you to override difference. Local communities where the level of social need was so great, it made it easy for multi-faiths and different faith groups within the Church of England to come together to respond to that need. And I quote from a local parish priest, "I observed that clergy came together to listen, to hear what was going on in the difficult, deprived area. There was a camaraderie as well as difference." Military chaplains who are recruited on the basis that they must be tolerant and respectful of every chaplain and every person in need in the military, regardless of belief or faith. And they said, "We're obliged to care for anyone who is suffering, and that includes those who think differently to you." And the chaplains are selected, developed, and performance managed by the military or the universities on their ability to work with difference. Some powerful examples were given about how the church had dealt with administering to AIDS victims, where some clergy felt unable to deliver the sacraments to those victims, while some of their colleagues wanted to. As one interviewee said, "I don't remember there was any shouting, there was no condemnation, there was no blanking of one another. If we met in the street or anything like that, there was a real sense of, well, we're sharing the trust together. And we're honouring what we genuinely felt God was calling each of us to do or not to do. And we learned to live with difference. I observed that legacy as a way of living with difference and not feeling threatened or competitive, or my way is better than your way." And last, everyday solution number 5. Respecting the main church as a historic institution to which individual clergy felt an obligation and an affection. Trusting those who have different values or perspectives was hard, but possible if those people could recognize and respect difference and yet want to work together for the overall good of the mission of the institution. In the interviews, I was struck by some who, whilst desperately disagreeing with the stance that the church was taking on LLF, wanted to carry on, and I quote, "journeying with my brothers and sisters." Very few talked to me of wanting to break away. Many interviewed felt that others needed to be reminded of the fact that being a member of any institution brought with it obligations and duties. And an archdeacon said to me, "We all have rights, but those rights also give us responsibilities." Lastly, many implored the church to not lose sight of the fact that you all have more in common than there is difference. And I finish with this quote, "There's been a failure of trust and a betrayal. That is what may be picked up by the world, but the rooted focus and sacramental basis on which we all belong, that is unchanging. Thank you.
Thank you. In their benevolence, the Business Committee have deemed that this item, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions now, and then we will move on to item 6, where we will have a debate. I say this in order to urge you to make sure your questions are questions and brief, because you will have a chance to debate shortly. So I will call questions in groups of 3, and if you can make your way to the podium when called. Thank you. Can I call lady in the stripy jumper and the gentleman behind you, please, followed by yellow T-shirt, one along. Thank you. Go ahead, thank you.
Joyce Hill, Leeds 327. My question is simply that, as I read this, it felt very clerical to me. There was a small number of people seemed to be interviewed as laity, but fundamentally it was research based on clergy surveys, and that's how I read it anyway, looking at the methodology at the end of the paper. And if further work is to be done, my question is, could care be taken to give due weight to the laity, since they are the majority in the Church of England? They are what the Church of England is. Bishops and priests are servants of the Church.
Thank you.
Not the Church.
Go ahead.
Hi, Chris Blunt, Chester 08989. So my question is to do with paragraphs 149, 150, that kind of area, where we're talking about trust in Jesus. And I was really struck as I read the report that it was all about the relational things that Jesus achieved on the cross rather than the moral things that he achieved for us on the cross. So it was all about breaking down dividing wall and creating a new community.
Question, please.
Yeah, so the issue is that there was no mention of justification or righteousness or being forgiven from sins. So my question is, it struck me that does this report go deep enough? In that we have a half gospel and a whole gospel, both sides of it, the ethical and the relational aspects of what Jesus did. Does it go deep enough?
Thank you for the sort of question. Go ahead.
Simon here, Chichester 287. My question really reiterates the first questioner about sample size. It did seem small, is that correct, for this kind of study? And also clergy versus lay representation. That seemed to be heavily clergy biased. And the second part of it is how were the interviewees selected? I may have missed that in the paper, but I'll be grateful for clarification.
Thank you. I'll invite the panel to respond.
Me again. I'm going to take questions 1 and 3. So the first question, could more attention be drawn to the laity? Yes. Were laity included in the interviews in this pilot study? Yes, they were. But could we do more? Absolutely, yes. In terms of the sample size, you're right, it's a small sample. I draw your attention to the fact that I had worked with 135 clergy before in the diocesan report that I did in 2018-2019. But in this current report, this is what we would call a pilot study done with qualitative research. And what we are trying to do is investigate what are some of the fundamental issues that are affecting trust building and trust repair within the church, and to find examples of this. What we are looking for guidance from Synod on is which areas would you like us to actually explore in greater depth and with greater breadth in terms of the sample. The sample was constructed by Bishop Martin. The interviewees, as explained in the report, The names of interviewees were sent to my office at the University of Bristol, and my PA team rang or contacted people. Some responded, some didn't. Everyone that was responded was interviewed. Those that didn't respond, I went back to Bishop Martin and asked for substitutes. We were conscious of getting a broad range of opinion, and also we were conscious of race and gender issues in constructing the sample.
I'm going to ask a question two, but just clarify, this wasn't a bunch of my mates. When Veronica says, what I did was I asked a group of bishops to come up with some nominees. I didn't know most of the people who were interviewed. In terms of the theological question, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that struck us as we went through this, and you'll see this in the report, that issues of forgiveness did not emerge through the interviews. And that, sort of late in the day, we noticed that. That's clearly an area that we've got to explore. So you've got some notes about that in the report, and I'll make a brief allusion to that when I introduce the motion. But that whole dynamic of sin and forgiveness is absolutely crucial in this, and the breakdown of trust is a reflection of our sinful behaviour. So therefore the ethical question needs to be moved much more into the theological content. So we will expect to do that as part of the next stage.
I'm going to give any members joining us on Zoom an opportunity to ask any questions. We'll just hold a moment to have a look if any raise their hands. In which case, we'll take some more from the floor. Question from you, sir, and Miranda Threlfall, thank you, and the lady behind you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for all those who worked on this, and I think the framework that we've just been presented
name,
with,
please.
Sorry, Ian Paul, 229, Sutherland, Nottingham. That framework, fourfold framework, is extremely helpful, I think. Quite a lot of the comments have been around the breakdown of trust between laity and clergy in the House of Bishops. It surely is not good for us as a church that trust in the House of Bishops is so low. So can I ask, when will the House of Bishops have this on the agenda, and what will they be doing to address changes in actions and behaviour which will rebuild trust?
Thank you.
Miranda Threlfall Holmes, Liverpool 156. Thank you very much. I really appreciated the paper. And you mentioned the benefits of a high trust environment, and also in the paper alluded quite strongly to the way in which issues of mistrust in our wider society have inevitably infiltrated into the church. I just wondered, I appreciate it was a qualitative study that you were focusing on, but I just wondered if there was any metric that you use in your research for the level of trust in an organisation, for what counts as a high trust or a low trust organisation, and if so, if there's any sense of how the Church of England scores against other possibly comparable institutions.
Hello, it's Janetta Lottie from Chester, 277. Thank you. I welcome the work that's being done, but what I would like to know is if we're going to do further qualitative research, would the team consider employing an independent qualitative researcher to have input into ensuring that there's more transparency and no bias in things like sampling and interpretation? Thank you.
Thank you. Having said that, we would have three. Is it okay if I sneak in a final fourth before we then close this item? Alison Coulter, question, please.
Very much, Chair. I'm interested in the relationship between accountability and trust. And my own experience is that where accountability is unclear, trust can be difficult. And my experience in the Church of England is that accountability is often unclear. So I wondered, is this an area that you gave much consideration to? And if not, could you look at this in more detail in the next part of your work? And a personal question for Veronica. I'm very interested in how you avoided not being holding an office in the Church of England. Can you tell me how?
Thank you. Do come and please respond.
If I could respond to Ian and Jeanette. Ian, interesting question. We obviously need to pursue this in the House, and there are, you'll hear me make reference to the fact that we need to be looking at this as bishops, and I would expect us to do that relatively soon, but I also think we, the group of us on this, or whoever's on this for the next stage, need to come up with some practical proposals that can be worked on and engaged with by the bishops. But all this has to happen before February, because that's when I retire. Sorry, Jeanette's question about independence. The whole reason for asking Veronica is because she's independent.
On metrics, it's quite normal for organisations. I can't see the person that answered the question, but hello. It's quite normal for organisations, particularly actually since the financial crisis, to measure themselves on trust. And very often what you are measuring is, in an employee attitude survey, is around those 4 areas, particularly around leadership and the organisation's purpose, around ability, benevolence, integrity and predictability. You don't ask them as starkly as that. And in the diocesan work, actually, in a way, relates into the question about laity. The clergy went out and used those 4 items to actually ask their congregations and their communities how they measured on those 4 things. Now, most of them used qualitative research. They did interviews. But it is perfectly possible, and it is a choice that the church might take, to actually turn that into survey material and look at the church from that respect. I did ask if there were any attitude surveys. I know Gordon asked people within Church House if I could be supplied with any survey material to see whether we could find correspondence between survey data and the themes that were emerging from the interviews. But I believe that that was difficult to do, and so we went ahead with the report with no comparative internal survey data from the church. In terms of the accountability, accountability is part of trust. And it's very often manifests itself in other organisations by bodies like this, actually leaders being held to account by general bodies like this. There is the fact that you've got a body like this that is holding people to account, and yet trust is not working well, would suggest that looking at accountability in a further study would be a very good idea. I would just like to say that some people get very muddled between transparency and accountability and trust. Transparency, it is not necessary to have 100% transparency of everything that is going on in an organisation in order to trust. Indeed, if you had 100% transparency, you don't need trust. That's the whole point of it, is that you can, if you trust, live with a certain amount of uncertainty. And that's why trust is so valuable for the vast majority of organisations in this world, because not everything can be 100% transparent at all times to all people. And there are various reasons for that. But as Professor Honora O'Neill says, who we interviewed as part of this study, she did the Wreath lectures on trust. The absence of total transparency is not a reason not to trust.
Thank you, and thank you for your questions. That concludes item 5.